Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening from wherever you are joining us today. Welcome to the third webinar in our Resilience Matters series. My name is John Richardson. I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm really delighted to be your host again for this session. Before we get going, I would really like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Bunurong people in the Kulin Nation here in Naarm or Melbourne. I also want to acknowledge that the traditional custodians of all the various lands on which you will be joining us today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be joining this event. I really want to pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been living with and caring for this country or these countries for tens of thousands of years, and certainly living with many of the hazards that that we are experiencing. So there's certainly plenty, I think, that we can learn from them as we are navigating these increasingly challenging situations that we find ourselves in. Before we get on to the topic, I'm going to do the usual sort of housekeeping stuff. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available along with the presentation slides after the event. This will come through in our updates from AIDR. So you can watch this at your leisure or share it with other people. We will be using the Q&A feature today on Zoom to take questions. So if you've got a question, please pop it in the Q&A and not in the chat, because it can get lost in the chat. You're going to be able to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I'll certainly do my best to try and ask all the questions that we have, or bring them together. But we do encourage you to use the chat window, share any thoughts that you might have or reflections, and just to, but as a reminder, you'll need to select everyone in the drop-down menu so that everyone gets to read them. Also, I'd like to remind you, please, to be respectful to each other and presenters when you're posting your comments. Please be aware that some of the content that we discuss may be distressing or may bring up prior experiences. In this instance, please use any techniques or strategies that you've developed to help you manage any adverse reactions. So, housekeeping out of the way, now let's start to get into the main game. So the Resilience Matters webinars, we've developed these to sort of focus on systems, environments, and human factors that intersect to influence the varying levels of kind of risk, harm, and equity that people experience before, during, and after disaster. When you're having a street corner conversation about bushfire risk, or you're in a recovery centre faced with someone who's been flooded for the third time, you maybe can't go on. Probably the last thing you are thinking about is policy. And I guess the good news is that you don't need to, because there are other people behind the scenes who are thinking about policy. It may seem a bit abstract at this point in time, but it is actually really very real, and influences the guide and guides the way that we act. I'm a big fan of policy and policy frameworks because they define the grounds on which we play. I'm reading a history of Australian rules football at the moment, and there were times in its infancy where the game would switch at halftime between Australian rules to rugby rules, and the teams would play a completely different game. And it's described as being confusing at the best. And this is what we don't need in disaster reduction and emergency management: confusion. So policy gives us that guidance and structure. What we're hoping to do today is give you that sense of how this policy environment can connect with the work that you do. There's a great Canadian blues guitarist, Harry Manx, who talks about his celestial blues marrying the Mississippi Delta with the atmosphere of the Himalaya. We're, of course, a bit more audacious, less audacious than that, but the idea is trying to bring these two together. So it will help you see how all this this work fits together and rolls up into the sort of policy frameworks that we have that govern this really complex and challenging area that we all work with. So this is enough from me. Let's get on to the main content. I'm really pleased to introduce Andrew Minack, the first Assistant Coordinator General of Policy and Governance at the National Emergency Management Agency. He has an extensive public sector career working at executive levels across all levels of government, and I've certainly had the pleasure of working with Andrew really closely as we've started to go into this next iteration of sort of AIDR's sort of history. So I'll shut up now, Andrew, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, John. Lovely introduction. History of Australian rules football. That might be a couple of chapters on holding the ball and deliberate out of bounds, a few other things for those Victorian colleagues who are following the humour. Look, first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity. I too would like to reiterate and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm basically here to provide, picking up your term, John, about the policy context in which emergency management operates. I have been in this space for a number of years, and again, a reflection I would make is this sector is classically driven by events, major natural disasters, leading to royal commissions or other inquiries, which then results in a step change of the sector. And I think it's important to apply in a proactive way the policy structures that we've got in place so we do get ahead of the game in terms of changing and evolving the emergency management sector as the context in which we operate changes as well. In terms of today, there's a couple of key things I just want to run through. First of all, I'll start big picture, a bit of NEMA's role, the policy context at a international and national level. Some of the governance arrangements, I think it's important to work out how the governance arrangements works in terms of key decision-making bodies, the evidence base on which we make those decisions, what NEMA delivers and linking it back into that policy context, and a little bit, a light touch on where we're going from here in terms of some of the key reviews that we already have in place. In terms of NEMA, that actually arose from a recommendation from the Royal Commission in terms of emergency management governance arrangements. And the recommendation was to have an end-to-end agency at a Commonwealth Government level, going all the way through from response, recovery, resilience, preparedness, the entire emergency management continuum. And again, I think that recommendation was a reflection that historically there'd been different agencies at a Commonwealth level doing different elements of the emergency management continuum, and the importance of integrating that end-to-end spectrum was really important. So NEMA was created by Commonwealth Government about 3 or 4 years ago. In terms of what it's responsible for, leading and coordinating the national action and assistance, we are a coordinator, a facilitator, how we bring together agencies from government, from the private sector, from the not-for-profit sector, from the community sector and households, building scalable, coordinated emergency management capability for nationally significant and international crisis. So we have a role in building up national capability, which we deploy, and I'll go to that in a moment. Developing evidence, intelligence and insights. And again, I think in the emergency management space, at some level, understandably, we will follow the event and respond accordingly. If you get into spaces like preparedness and resilience and betterment, all those decisions are based on your understanding of the risk and what are the mitigation options you've got in front of you. And then finally, we support states and territories and local government to save lives, reduce harm and mitigate the consequences of disasters. And as John mentioned, I've got a background both in state government and local government. So that issue about how different tiers of government work and how you coordinate is really important. I might then just go on to the next slide, which is a presentation on the context and some of the changes and events that have evolved since 2016. So if we could just run that slide. Thanks for that. So this is a slide that goes back to 2016 to 2025. It reflects the activations that have occurred at a local government level. And when you look at the numbers, 751 disasters, 521 LGAs impacted, and 5,548 declarations. That's a declaration of an impacted LGA from a natural disaster. It shows how things are evolving rapidly, and the convergence of hazards and cascading, compounding and complex events is really stark and really clear. The other comment I'd make on this graph is for some local government areas, even since 2020, they've declared a natural disaster up to half a dozen times in the LGA. So if you think of LGA basically declaring a natural disaster more than once every 12 months, it's a reflection of the reality we find ourselves, which is a permanent state of response and recovery. And I think the other key message from this slide is it's fundamentally necessary to discard the notion that national scale crisis occurs infrequently. We're continuously now experiencing these events. And if you couple this context of emergency management with the geopolitical issues, global cost of living pressures, and a range of other issues, this is a really complex environment we're all working in at the moment. If I reflect on even the last high-risk weather season, as in 24-25, what do we have? We started back in December, seems a long time ago, which was the Grampians fires, 70,000 hectares burnt, major fire in Western Victoria, and those in Victoria would know that it's really dry in the western part of that state, going through to major floods, TC Alfred, and then the New South Wales floods in May. So you've had several months of major events occurring sequentially. We're already back into the Northern Territory fire season for 25-26. So what we're seeing is, and if you reflect on the last season, is that records have been broken, rainfall intensities are increasing, extreme heat, and what that has resulted in further exhaustion of our communities and first responders. And again, the challenges, and I think back to John's point about the policy context, we need to keep going back to those framework documents, but what we do and how we evolve to respond to these changing environments. I mean, to put it bluntly, emergency management's never been more complicated. And again, I think everyone on this call would realise the stress and strains that we're under. Couple of things that we've picked up at NEMA is, as you can see in this slide, the impact on regions isn't equally across all areas. Those regions who are impacted repeatedly are exhausted and aren't actually coming out of the recovery stage before the next event occurs. And classically, if you look at recovery, fire and flood or any other natural disaster, it's a 3 or 5 year rebuild. So again, if you go into an event space within a 5 year period, you're never out of recovery, and it just continuously churns through people and resources, and people never get a kind of clear air to kind of fully recover. The final comment I'd make on this slide is, given the size, scale and complexity, NEMA's got a role, everyone on this call's got a role, but this is going to be classically a whole of society response. It is, yes, the public sector, it's the private sector, it's a not-for-profit sector, but this is going down to a household level in terms of how people collectively come together to respond to this changing environment. If we just go then to the next slide, and that just setting the kind of policy context, in terms of the legal policy environment which we operate, under Australia's constitutional arrangements, Australia's state and territory governments are the first responders to events. So this is your SES, fire services, maritime agencies, etc. So they're first responders within their jurisdictions. And again, I think it's important from a Commonwealth government level, we're very respectful of the role, constitutional role of state, territories and local government. But again, one of the reflections is when they drafted the Constitution, issues like Black Summer, Alfred, major flood events, crossing over state and territory borders were never kind of considered in terms of how they've designed the constitutional arrangements. So we're very mindful of respecting those arrangements, but again, from a Commonwealth Government perspective, doing more to provide support on the ground to state, territory and local governments. And in a specific sense, a couple of key things we do from a operational capability perspective is we provide a national shared situational awareness to coordinate national action. So that's the National Situation Room, which essentially is the hub at Commonwealth Government level for responding to a major event. National security capabilities for significant crisis, which can be deployed. One of the key threshold questions we have before we get involved is managing crises that exceed capacity of affected multiple jurisdictions. So again, when you have an event which is beyond the capacity capability of a state or territory, we step in to provide support, and be that through agencies we fund like Disaster Relief Australia, or classically working with defence in terms of deployment of defence assets. We also have a role in terms of looking out in terms of international arrangements. So again, in terms of deployment coming through, and I'm sure people on this call would see, you know, New Zealanders, Canadians, people in the US, Japan, elsewhere being deployed back into Australia to help with natural disasters. So there's a number of things we do from a coordination perspective. And then in a recovery sense, we have a number of policy levers and program levers that we pull when required. And that's a key focus we have in terms of providing financial assistance to communities. And I'll step through that in a bit of detail. But they're the kind of constitutional arrangements. The reflection I would make is, if I look historically, from a sector which predominantly many years ago focused on response and then increasingly recovery, and now it's gone response, recovery to resilience. So again, the focus being spread out across the continuum to ensure we actually get ahead of the game in terms of improving the resilience of Australian communities. So if that's the national kind of policy constitutional context, we just go to the next slide, and just a light touch in terms of our international commitments. There's a number which relate to the emergency management sector. The three key ones are the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which goes from 2015 to 2030. The COP21, which is the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which run up to 2030. From the UN perspective, and we have dealings with them frequently, they recognise the high level of interconnectivity and interdependencies between these three frameworks. And our job from a NEMA perspective is providing information back into the UN in terms of how we're going against each of those frameworks. So collectively, internationally, Paris Agreement, Sustainable Development Goals, and the Sendai Framework provide a guidance for action on sustainable climate-aligned goals, and also actions in terms of disaster resilience. So that's the international context. If I just go to the next slide, just a bit more detail on how that then cascades down from international to national policy frameworks. So the UN Sendai Framework, which was adopted by member states, including Australia in 2015, has a number of key goals in terms of reducing harm, reducing loss of life, and reducing the impact of natural disasters. And the Sendai Framework then is the framework in which we've developed a number of national policy frameworks. And the key one is the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, the NDRRF. It's emergency management. What we need is another acronym. Well, there's another one to put on the table. That was endorsed by First Ministers in all jurisdictions in 2020 to implement the Sendai Framework. So that's how it cascades down. The NDRRF sets the foundational work required nationally across all sectors to reduce risk, disaster risk, and minimise impacts of natural disasters. And then as you cascade down from the NDRRF, we then have national action plans. And if we just go to the next slide, as you cascade down, thank you, we've then got what we call the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, which that document was publicly released in April 2019, endorsed by COAG in 2020, and it's targeted to specific sectors and policy areas to provide a strategic framework for systemic risk reduction efforts. And that's a whole of system document. So again, classically in emergency management, it goes to the event, responding to the event and recovering from the event. This document framework, yes, clearly picks up emergency management core functions, but also picks up land use planning, infrastructure and investment, social policy, agriculture, education, community development, energy and the environment. And often I say emergency management is a bit like working in a kind of whole of government central agencies. Its tentacles go off in every direction, and that document, the risk reduction framework, reflects that. And from a NEMA perspective and from state, territory, local governments, it sets the frame for how we actually then identify actions and how we prioritise work across a range of different sectors. If I then just go to the next slide, what you'll see is we've got what we call the second NAP shorthand, which is the second National Action Plan, which talks about some of the key priorities that we need to take up to 2030. This document was endorsed by all the emergency management ministers across the country in 2023. There was extensive consultation undertaken to develop the plan, including the From Risk to Resilience Summit and a whole raft of online in-person forums. And again, the key goals from that are to take action to reduce existing disaster risks, minimise creation of future disaster risks, and equip decision makers with frameworks to make decision making. Again, we are very, very focused on making sure anything that comes out nationally reflects and aligns with any state or local government policies. So again, we don't want to come over the top, for want of a better term. We want to clearly work in partnerships with state, local and other stakeholders. What this has done then is, from a NEMA perspective, when we're trying to work out our priorities, it provides a framework and a prioritisation process in terms of what actions we want to focus on. And as you can see, key ones: understanding disaster risk, accountable decision-making, enhanced investment, governance, ownership and responsibility. So I might just pause there, but that's the kind of policy context we operate, cascading down from international to a national level. Then in a governance sense, in terms of how you implement those policy framework documents, there's a couple of key forums I just want to talk about. So if I just go to the next slide, I might just start at the top in terms of from a minister perspective. Obviously, we've just had a federal election. Minister McBain is the Minister for Emergency Management and also Minister for Local Government, which is actually super useful because there's a lot of crossovers between this space and local government, and also Minister for Territories. Josh Wilson is the Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Emergency Management. And again, he wears two hats, one in the emergency management side and the other one in climate change and energy. So reporting through to Minister Bowen on climate adaptation. And then we've got a special envoy, Kate Thwaites, working in the emergency management space as well. Again, I just want to emphasise this is a deliberate decision by government to greater integration between the emergency management policy agenda and the policy agenda on climate adaptation coming out of the Federal Department of Environment. So again, we work very closely. We have historically, but again, at a ministerial level, there's a lot of crossover between ourselves in terms of resilience and climate adaptation. So that's just over the top, the kind of governance from a ministerial perspective. There's two key forums that operate in the emergency management space. Firstly, there's the NEM, National Emergency Management Ministers Meeting, that brings together all the emergency management ministers and from all jurisdictions. It also has the Deputy President of ALGA, the Australian Local Government Association, acknowledgement of the important role ALGA plays in this space. And also the New Zealand Emergency Management Minister is a permanent observer and a kind of reflection of the strong links we have with New Zealand. Then underneath that, at a senior officials level, is Australian New Zealand Emergency Management Committee, and ZEMSI for short. That brings together all the leads from both the emergency response and also recovery organisations in respective states and territories, ALGA, Australian Local Government Association, and New Zealand. From a priority perspective, NZEMSI's there basically at official level to deliver the direction as identified by NEM. But a couple of key things we're focusing on is clearly alignment and understanding of risk reduction, increasing considerations of risk management and decision-making, adopting national approaches to preparedness and recovery, improving data sharing, and building on future capabilities. A couple of observations or reflections I would make on this is historically, both for the NEM and also NZEMSI, it has been led by emergency management ministers and senior officials, which historically have focused on response. What we've broadened out on the back of a report we did in terms of the emergency management governance arrangements is having both response and recovery at the table. So we had a NEM meeting, the Emergency Management Ministers meeting in Darwin last week, and for the first time we had a number of states send ministers who were responsible for recovery. And again, what that did, it kind of changes the tone of conversation. It's both response, but increasingly intersecting with the recovery work that states and territories are doing. And again, the type of issues that were discussed last week at NEM, there's a bit of a reflection on the season we've just gone through, issues around local government capability, insurance affordability, risk profile and other things. So NEM meets 3 times a week, I wish, 3 times a year, as does NEM. So that's the governance arrangements that sits over the top. In terms of just the next slide about what we do and in terms of building readiness, I've talked about a national policy setting. I think it's useful to talk about how we understand risk and some of the data sets we have at a national level that we utilise to inform decision making. And then I'll run through to aligning investment and building capability. But again, the key message I just want to put with this slide is that integration of policy settings, risk analysis, and then decisions on investment and building capability and the alignment of those 4 streams of thinking. If I just go to the next slide, one of the key pieces of work that we've done at NEMA is to develop a national risk profile. And again, it was a reflection of a number of reports have said that there hasn't been an agreed whole of nation focus or agreement on national risk and how you would assess it. And one of the reasons we do that is at a Commonwealth government level, we spend a lot of money on recovery, understandably. We're now running and managing a budget of about $25 billion. And that has rapidly escalated over the last decade. It will continue to escalate for obvious reasons, but increasingly we're being asked the legitimate question about what is the basis of making those decisions, especially when it comes to resilience and betterment in terms of how we prepare communities. And without a good understanding of risk, our investments run the risk of not hitting the mark. And the other comment I'd make is those decisions and the significant funding decisions will be clearly undermined if we don't have an agreed understanding of what those data sets are and the risk profile. Again, I just want to emphasise in developing this, we've worked very closely with state, territory and local government agencies in terms of developing this risk profile. And we've also worked closely in terms of making sure that this risk profile aligns as best it can with any state or local government level. And again, I just want to shout out, there's a lot of fantastic work that's occurring, state, territory and local government in terms of managing risk. So the genesis of this national risk profile came from a request from NZEMSI and NEM to develop this national risk profile. We've worked with experts across insurance sector, government sector, private sector, to develop what is called a minimal viable product. So that's effectively the end of stage one of this work. The minimal viable product is intended to produce an initial risk profile based on available data. The 4 hazards we're focused in on is riverine flood, bushfire, tropical cyclone, and heat wave. And I appreciate there's a number of other hazards that aren't covered off. They've been identified based on the analysis of insurance risk losses, and I think most people would be aware that the key driver of insurance costs is flood damage. So picking up a riverine flood is one of the key number one priorities for this first stage of work. And the profile goes down to LGA, local government area level. It identifies a range of consequences for each hazard. It uses the catastrophic loss model, which I won't bore with the detail, but that's the same model that's used by the insurance industry. And then they use models in terms of predicting likelihood of events and running through the classic exposure, vulnerability, and overall risk profile down to an LGA level. Out of that, you end up with a calculation of the average annual impact. Again, that's been used by the insurance sector repeatedly in terms of assessing the value of risk. So this is stage one. It's early days, but it was really important to actually have that shared view of risks across the country. If I just go to the next slide, in terms of a couple other key products that we use, that's a risk profile. In terms of vulnerabilities of communities, that's also a key metric in terms of assessing the impact of a natural disaster on a community. It's critical in terms of how we respond. And the slide you've got there is a piece of work that the Natural Hazards Research Australia has developed. And this is the AIDR, again, another acronym, apologies, which is Australian Disaster Resilience Index. It was first released in July 2020 following the Black Summer bushfires, and it was actually updated and re-released in June 2025. The darker areas of the map in front of you represents locations where higher levels of social vulnerability exist, and essentially the greener the map, the stronger the more resilient those communities are. And what this is used is in terms of resource and recovery planning, how we support community engagement, informing strategic planning, and monitoring evaluation. So that's the document that we use to assess the risk of communities. Just very briefly, the other product, I haven't got a slide to cover it off, but we've been working very closely with the insurance sector in terms of the National Insurance data set. That's basically all the insurance data from the HIP members, which is the Hazard Insurance Partnership. So it's about 80% of the market. We've been working with the ABS to provide a profile of issues around insurance affordability and accessibility. So that's a really important piece of work, foundational piece of work that will be, again, utilised in terms of decision-making. And talking to the ABS, it's a world first in terms of actually pulling this data together for policymakers. If I then go to the next slide, so this is the kind of risk profile. I then just go to what we're doing, and I won't go through all this detail. I know this has got a fair bit of detail on this slide, but essentially, in summary, investment in recovery and reconstruction has increased significantly since Black Summer bushfires. If I go 10 years ago, we probably spent about a bit over $50 million on resilience. Now we're spending about $4.3 billion on resilience. So that is an investment which is outside an event and preparing communities for the next natural disaster. And a couple of key components of that is things like the Resilience Home Program in Northern New South Wales, which is $700 million jointly funded between Commonwealth and state. That's homes buybacks, house raisings, other kind of resilience measures at a household level. We do a raft of programs in Queensland in terms of preparing households for the impact of cyclones, resilience kids programs, and a number of other betterment programs that we fund through the DRFA, which is Disaster Recovery Funding Arrangements. The other program we run is the Disaster Ready Fund, which I'll get to in a moment. But the key message I just want to say there is that there has been calls for a long time about shifting the investment from response and recovery to response, recovery and resilience. And that has progressively occurred over the last 10 years. Is more need to be done? Yes, but there has been significant shifts in the funding profile from recovery to recovery and resilience. If I just then go to the next slide, just talking about a bit more detail in terms of tangible things we're doing on the ground. The Disaster Ready Fund, that's a $200 million a year commitment from the Commonwealth Government, which is run through a competitive grant program. It's generally matched by proponents coming out of state or local government or not-for-profits. And it provides the key source in terms of improving the resilience of communities. So just as an example, the type of work we do in round one, there was about 150 odd projects, ended up in investment about $300 million. And this goes all the way down from hard infrastructure in terms of improving the resilience of communities to places like New South Wales around Lismore, Northern Rivers, where the government's invested over $11 million in better understanding the Richmond River catchment around Lismore in terms of future flood events. So that was engaging CSIRO to do this piece of work. So again, we work both at a kind of data assurance and collecting data to better understand the operation of future events, in this case floods. And then we also work at the other end of the spectrum in terms of co-funding major infrastructure projects. And again, there's a few examples there on the slide in terms of various pieces of work that we've done around the country. We're just going through round three, so that's going through the assessment project at the moment. But again, I just want to kind of call out the work that we're doing in terms of we assessing the risk and then what do we do about it? Well, these type of programs are actually all about minimising the risk and impact of communities on the ground. One thing I just will comment on, a lot of this focus is understandably on flood mitigation and understanding flood risks. I mentioned the one around Northern Rivers, but similarly in places like Western New South Wales, the Coonawarra Flood Resilience Project in Moyne in Western Victoria. And there's a raft of other kind of flood-related pieces of work that we're funded through the Disaster Ready Fund. So again, just for those people on the call who suspect by definition have got some work in the emergency management space, that's the kind of key funding source for a whole raft of programs that we run through every year. So in summary, the Disaster Ready Fund and the Disaster Ready Funding Arrangements, they're the two key core funding mechanisms we have in the emergency management space. And connecting it back to where we started with the National Action Plan, the second NAP, that's how the actions identified in those policy frameworks are delivered. A couple of things I might just mention just while we're talking about resilience. If I just go to the next slide, we've worked very closely with the insurance sector and we've come up with a National Resilience Action Library. So this is a public collection of evidence-based household mitigation activities against flood, fire and cyclone. There's 200 different entries across a range of actions that are now publicly available. That's on the NEMA website. And again, I mentioned before that responding to the environment we're in emergency management is a whole of community level. That clearly does include what can the household do to better protect the house from natural disasters. Yes, we obviously, of course, acknowledge the fact that there's some houses that doesn't matter what we do at a household level. When the flood comes through, it'll come through. But there are actions that can be taken, and that's effectively a really useful source in terms of what households can do. And if I just go to the next slide, there's also work we're doing around awareness modules. And again, this is relating to resilient homes and what they can do to better protect their homes from floods. So they're just some tangible information tools that we do. So I just thought it'd be useful just to kind of highlight, again, that's another stream of work that NEMA does. I'm just looking at the clock and I'll wrap up in the next couple of minutes. If I just go to the next slide, I've just kind of gone from international, national policy frameworks to how we understand risk and the evidence we use to make decisions and what actions we do in terms of funding programs. But going forward, nothing stands still. I started with the fact that we're in a dynamic environment, a rapidly changing environment. There's been two key reviews, the Glasser review, which went into governance arrangements. I mentioned that in terms of impact that's had in terms of broadening out governance arrangement for emergency management to resilience and recovery to get a better spectrum and representation around the table. The other key one I suspect a lot of people on this call would be aware of is the Colvin review, which was into emergency management funding arrangements. That came up with 47 key recommendations across 5 key themes: strengthen Commonwealth coordination, setting clear outcomes for investment. Again, my reflection observation on the sector is understandably it's input driven because it's responding to an event. If I take a step back, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve to better prepare the Australian community for natural disasters? Better use of evidence and risk information. Again, I've just gone through a couple of examples of the work we're doing now around improving our evidence and risk information, funding program reform, and enhanced engagement with non-government partners. And again, I just touch on that in terms of communities which have been disproportionately impacted by natural disasters. That is a key focus of the Colvin review. As people may or may not know, that is now actively under consideration by the government. And I think the opportunity there is when the government responds to that event, that will also then articulate the next stage and evolution of the emergency management sector in Australia. And that'll start, again, I think, at a top level in terms of some of those national policy frameworks. Are they still fit for purpose, whether they need to be reviewed or not? That's, one of the considerations under consideration by the Commonwealth Government. John, I know that's been pretty rapid, but that's the kind of run through from policy frameworks to understanding risk to delivery. I might just pause there. I think it's already almost 10 to 2 and happy to take any questions. Thanks, John.
And draw a breath, Andrew. Fantastic, thank you. Look, a great tour through the different frameworks and looking at how they articulate to across both across the country, but vertically as well as sort of horizontally. So I think it was good to see how going from global down and then thinking about sustainable development, climate change adaptation, and also DRR. And I was really interested in your reflections around the government priorities of effectively locating portfolios like climate change adaptation and sort of EM/DRR in with an assistant minister. So that's certainly pleasing. We've got a number of questions, so I might start by there's an interesting question here, I think. So Andrew, how do you measure and monitor the outcomes of decision making guided by the national framework into or in regional or local levels?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've done extensive piece of work over the last couple of years to improve our assurance, governance, and evaluation of the programs we deliver. So we meet quarterly and do a major review of all the funding decisions and programs we've funded in terms of delivery. So increasingly with state, territories, and local government, they are kind of set reviews of the delivery of the funding we've provided to states, territories, and local government. And John, I think one of the challenges it's highlighted is for impacted regions, especially regions who have been impacted by multiple events, their kind of capacity and capability to deliver a recovery or resilience program is completely stretched. And it's not surprising if you go out to some of those regions. But again, I think that piece of work of assurance and evaluation is crucial, again, to inform future decisions, but also highlight, and again, anyone from local government, I'm sure will agree, a lot of this ends up with local government on-ground delivery. And for local governments, you often end up after a major event, their capital works program might have increased by tenfold. Well,
Yeah.
we don't have the project engineers and quantity surveyors and all the rest of it to deliver that. So again, we are significantly enhancing our assurance and evaluation work to actually improve and make more effective how we manage these programs, but also, John, in an appropriate way, when people understand, well, if you've got a $25 billion program of works, what's it delivering? We've got that assurance about the money that we get from taxpayers is being effectively spent.
Yeah, and you mentioned that sum, and you think about $25 billion, buys a lot of educational healthcare or other things. So you're sort of thinking about, and we sometimes don't think about this, but you sort of think, well, what are the other things decisions we could be making or government could be making with those funds? Because you also don't just magic up those funds, do you? Like it's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah. And rest assured, John, I think people are now thinking about that question about money that's being spent in the sector and its effectiveness. Now, I will say, at the end of the day, we're always there to respond. But I think one of the challenges we've got is the way the spending curve has gone has been rapidly escalating. And I think one of the legitimate questions, John, is back to resilience, is if we rebuild the bridge and it gets washed away at the next flood, quite rightly, I think we need to think smarter about how we get ahead of that game so we don't end up, to use the term, repeat business on bridges and roads and other public assets that we're not building to a standard that can withstand the next event.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I was at the global conference recently, and they were talking about, because we often talk about resilience as being almost counter to efficiency if you think about what it means. But the UN have been sort of talking about resilience is actually long-term efficiency. If we build it in at the start, then you're right. We're not replacing those roads or those bridges. It might cost us a bit more at the start, but down the track, it's not costing us anymore, or a lot less. So that is really important. I'll pick up another question. We've got one from Ella Wilkinson at MAV. You mentioned work around betterment through DRFA in Queensland. Is there opportunity for betterment to be considered in other states and territories? Betterment is a key challenge, particularly for local governments.
Yeah, so just rest assured, betterment is available to all states and territories. So under the Disaster Ready Funding Arrangements, DRFA, classically what happens post-event is they'll put in for the recovery expenditure, but then they'll put in for a component of betterment, resilience, to improve the assets. So definitely all states have the opportunity to apply for that, and certainly Victoria historically has applied for betterment funding as well. So that's definitely available across all states and territories.
Yeah, okay, thank you. We've got... there's a question here. Are there plans to expand the national risk profile to be sort of more systemic risk focused rather than hazard focused?
We're looking to expand it. Well, I think we're looking initially in terms of the hazards it's identified to do further detailed work on the ones we've identified, because I think we want to make sure in terms of flood, fire, cyclone, that we've got a very good understanding, detailed understanding of how that risk profile works. John, we're already in kind of discussion about what are the next set of hazards that we would put into the risk profile.
Yeah.
But I think with this type of tool, you need to get to a level where it's got enough credibility, enough detail, that its usefulness for policymakers is almost like it's a demonstration project about how this risk profiles would operate.
Yeah, and I guess there is a body of work around systemic risks that started with the profiling Australia's vulnerability and the or even the risk reduction frameworks that are based on that. So there's I guess there's opportunities to build off that as well. We might have time for one more, I think, and there's plenty of questions here. I'm trying to see who's upvoted. Jane Sexton has 3 votes. So human resources are building effective disaster management and resilience, both paid and volunteer, which is going to your point earlier, Andrew, is highly stressed and diminishing in decline. What can be done to address this? And do you think it's time to consider non-traditional forms of capability, including volunteerism, to shore up disaster management resources?
Yeah, I will say this issue about capability is fundamental to anything we do, to be honest. Again, the reflection I would make about the emergency management sector is weirdly, when we're in an event and we surge to the usual suspects, i.e. those people already within the sector. I think COVID is the exemplar of how it could and should operate, which is it was whole of community from a public sector government perspective. Every department, every agency lent in to help out with that response. And so I think there's some kind of institutional barriers in terms of how we better connect. And that's one of the jobs NEMA has in terms of working across all government agencies to make sure their emergency management function is set to go. I will go, though, to the fact that I think there's some institutional issues in terms of the way the sector operates from a resourcing perspective. And what I mean by that is I think there's still some rigidity in terms of how rostering and other arrangements operate and whether they are now fit for purpose in terms of the evolving and different expectations of staff, be it paid staff or volunteer staff. And again, I think the sector needs to shift in terms of how it operates. And look, the final comment I'd make, because it was actually volunteering was discussed at NEM last week. I think there is a major opportunity around spontaneous volunteering. I think classically we're used to the kind of, you're a volunteer, you get trained up, you get registered. I think we all collectively need to think through how we can be more agile in terms of incorporating the spontaneous volunteering and what I call the non-traditional volunteering. So when there is an event, we can actually accommodate and where appropriately kind of guide and direct that volunteering component.
Yeah, good points there, Andrew. And I think there's also then that and we're seeing a lot of good practice around the country around that community-based resilience activities and communities that are coming together and self-organizing to I suppose almost to like take the pressure off sort of response. So I think that's the other area that we're certainly seeing greater emphasis on. And obviously I think support previously through first 2 rounds of DRF, there's been a lot of support for those sorts of activities. So if we can take the harm out of the system, I think that's important.
Yeah, agree.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for. Really want to thank you, Andrew, for your insights and that tour through and not drawing breath, I think, which is really impressive through all that. So thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. I'm hoping people will walk away, and I hope you all now walk away and sort of think, okay, well, what does this mean to me? Like now I get this. There is a bigger picture. There is some frameworks. So how do I apply this in my context? So just a couple of thank yous before we close off. Certainly want to thank in our team, Angela Draper, Charlotte Fell, and Simone Decker for their work on making the webinar sort of possible. Acknowledge the support of the National Emergency Management Agency for actually, supporting us to do this work, and particularly Kieran O'Donnell, who in the DRR branch I know helped pull this together. We're going to take a break from webinars in the next month because we've got the Australian Disaster Resilience Conference coming up in Perth from the 27th, 28th of August. If you haven't booked your tickets, do so now. It promises to be a really exciting event, and it's in the great state of Western Australia, and I say that as a Victorian, so it should be great. We are next, if you are going, we will be running a workshop on thinking about systemic risk and thinking systemically. So that will be really exciting. And then we'll return in September with the fourth webinar in this series, where we will be looking at traditional Indigenous knowledge in disaster risk reduction from Dr. Biami Williamson, who is no stranger to us here at AIDR. So more information about that will be coming soon. When you leave this call, this webinar, you'll be taken to a short survey. Please complete it. It helps us know whether we're hitting the mark. But also, if you've got any ideas on what you want us to sort of focus on into the future, we will always welcome that. It's been my real pleasure to host you this afternoon. And so until next time, please stay well.